In 1851, the Fugitive Slave Law was signed into law. Effectively, it spread the legality of slavery into the North by requiring that Northerners capture and return fugitive slaves to their owners. The battle lines were thus drawn between the North and the South, and in the northern states, like Massachusetts, between those states who upheld the status quo and the abolitionists. A man like Frederick Douglass was free, and his freedom had been purchased, and he was in no danger. But there were fugitive slaves passing through the northern states daily. They were now in danger. The only haven of the safe haven of the North was no longer there. The Fugitive Slave Law roused otherwise quiet men and otherwise ordinary intellectuals of the period to extraordinary anger. Ralph Waldo Emerson, for instance, quiet man and dignified, a spiritual leader now known across America and in England, vowed that he would never obey the Fugitive Slave Law. And Henry David Thoreau, quiet naturalist who had spent 2 years at Walden Pond, leaving the world of American politics behind, what about Thoreau? His response was no longer quiet. He was no longer a pacifist. He became, in the next few years, part of the Underground Railroad in Concord, Massachusetts. And this, in a curious sort of way, tends to validate his earlier spiritual insights, another way of proclaiming the transcendence of the individual spirit. But of all the responses to the Fugitive Slave Law, none had more impact than the book written by this woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Praised, admired, attacked, cursed. Uncle Tom's Cabin was nevertheless read by so many people that it became the all-time best-selling book for the rest of the 19th century, and it has never been out of print since. Welcome to English 3350, a survey of American literature before the Civil War. We're in Studio 3 at the M.D. Anderson Library on the main campus of the University of Houston. I'm Barry Wood, and today we're going to look at the impact of the Fugitive Slave Law on American literature. We begin with Thoreau. On September 30th, 1851, Henry Williams, an escaped slave, free, living in Boston, warrants went out for his arrest, and the police called at his Boston home. Fortunately, Henry Williams was out at the time they called. He got the news and knew that he was in danger, and so he set out on foot to Concord, to the home of the Thoreaus, where Henry David Thoreau lived with other relatives. Henry Williams bore a letter from the Abolitionist leader, William Lloyd Garrison, a letter of introduction, and Thoreau lodged him for the night. Next night, Thoreau purchased him a railroad ticket to Burlington, Vermont. This is merely one example of Thoreau's quiet assistance to escaped slaves that is recorded. Not all of them were recorded, but a number were. For instance, on July 28th, 1853, a young Harvard man by the name of Conway was visiting Emerson in Concord. Emerson decided that this young man would like to meet Thoreau, and so introduced him. Thoreau and Conway set up a friendship and agreed that the next day they would go for a long walk through the woods together. Next morning, when Conway found Thoreau, Thoreau was busy nursing a fugitive slave who had come in on foot during the night. Conway had to wait a full day. Thoreau nursed him, fed him, bathed him, and stood guard over him for a full day, and that evening escorted him to the railroad, purchased his ticket, and made sure that he was sent off safely to Canada. On November 1st, 1853, the Thoreaus lodged a free Negro woman in their home while she collected funds to buy the freedom of her husband, who was still a slave in Norfolk, Virginia. Now, we need to perhaps keep in mind that the Fugitive Slave Law called for a $1,000 fine for anyone who fed or harbored or assisted a fugitive slave law, along with 6 months in prison. So you can see that people like Thoreau, and of course there were others, but Thoreau was certainly a leader in Concord, were almost weekly risking their freedom. According to others who knew Henry David Thoreau, rarely a week went by without a fugitive slave coming through Concord. And more than anyone else, Thoreau was part of the Underground Railroad and almost a ringleader in Concord. It was most often Thoreau who looked after them, kept them overnight, purchased tickets, escorted them to the railroad, sometimes escorted them to another town nearby, West Fitchburg, where there was a smaller station and it was considered safer for a fugitive slave. And sometimes he even got on the train, purchased a ticket for himself, and accompanied them for several miles until they were out of danger. In April 1854, Thoreau was fired up to the point of explosion. A free man, an escaped slave by the name of Anthony Burns, working in Boston, was suddenly confronted by his former master from Virginia, arrested, and shipped back to Virginia. And nothing the abolitionists could do, including a raid on the jail to rescue him, could do anything to avert this. The situation was highly explosive. An abolitionist meeting was called in the town of Farmingham, near Concord. Thoreau welded together notes and entries from his journal and delivered a speech on July 4th, 1854, called Slavery in Massachusetts. Here are some excerpts from that speech. It was a searing indictment of the government which would allow slavery and would willingly ship a fugitive slave back to the South. It was a far more outspoken speech than resistance to civil government. This was no mere arrest for a night in Concord jail for a failure to pay $2 and some change in a poll tax. And the shipping of Anthony Burns back to Virginia was a violation, as Thoreau saw it, of basic human rights. And Thoreau had been guilty. He would admit that. He had paid his tax. Anthony Burns had been shipped back, even though from any decent human perspective, he was an innocent man. One can sense Thoreau's righteous indignations in some of these things. He says, "My thoughts are murder to the state." His fury was evident. The law will never make men free. It is men who have got to make the law free. They are the lovers of law and order who observe the law when the government breaks it. So Thoreau's pacifism that we see in civil disobedience or in resistance to civil government and in Walden, his disinvolvement with politics that is so evident in the introductory section to Walden, this is over. And he applauded then at the end of the speech when this man, William Lloyd Garrison, burned a copy of the U.S. Constitution. This is the sort of thing we think of as part of the 20th century, maybe as part of the 60s flag burning and so on. Well, it happened in 1854 at that speech in Framingham, after Thoreau's speech in Framingham, Massachusetts. And slavery in Massachusetts, that speech was then published later that month in William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator newspaper, the anti-slavery newspaper, and in the New York Tribune. But the greatest influence, the most powerful voice of all against slavery was that of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Born in 1811, lived to the age of 85, almost to the end of the century. Born in Litchfield, Connecticut, in this home. Her father, Lyman Beecher, was a Calvinist minister. This was a theological family. She had 7 brothers, all of whom were ministers, including Henry Ward, who is regarded as perhaps the most powerful pulpit minister of his day. From ages 13 to 21, she attended the female seminary at Hartford, Connecticut, learned languages, Latin, French, Greek. She herself absorbed a very high-powered education with a lot of history, a lot of theology. It was, in fact, her sister who had founded this little seminary. And Harriet, towards the end of this 7-year period, when she was 20 or 21, she herself had a chance to do some teaching in the seminary. In 1832, this would be when she was 21, her father was appointed president of Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, Cincinnati was a kind of intellectual center. Keep in mind that it was the West in those days. This was often called the Athens of the West. And the whole family moved there, and Harriet and her sister Catherine, who had set up the seminary in Hartford, taught school then in Cincinnati. And there, Harriet met this man who was on the faculty of Lane Theological Seminary, Calvin Stowe. And in 1836, at the age of 25, they were married. She raised a large family. In fact, she was a dutiful and good and efficient housewife, and everything that she accomplished was against the background of a full range of housewifely duties. Her character was formed by the fact that she was surrounded by theologians. Her father, all of her brothers, even her 2 sisters were actively involved in the reform movement out of religious principles, the women's movement, and her sister involved in education. It has been said that as a child, Harriet Beecher Stowe was somewhat given to morbid introspection. As an adult, she was also somewhat subject to depression and poor health. 6 years into her marriage, at the age of 31, she wrote to her husband startling words. She said, "Life is half gone. What have we done? It is time to prepare to die." Partially, I suppose, this was the result of being surrounded by such talent and intellect. As I say, Catherine was a pioneer in the women's movement, and her half-sister Isabella was involved in the women's movement too. And partly it was a lack of money too. They really could not afford any domestic help, and her husband was often away on trips, But her sense of humor seems to have stood despite all of this. It seems to have been the saving feature for her life. In this connection, I think it's worth, if you're enrolled in this course, you probably ought to read carefully the introduction in the anthology, especially page 2349, the left-hand column, which gives almost a humorous picture of Stowe trying to manage the responsibilities of a housewife with her husband away, too many kids, too many things to do. And of course, any mother of a large family today will relate instantly to her situation. Somehow, through all of this, Harriet began to write. She managed to publish sketches in New York magazines that brought in a little money, and it's also she also experienced slavery, and it's not surprising, given the flow of escaped slaves from Kentucky through Cincinnati, that her later novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, would in fact be placed in Kentucky. Let's look at a map to get a picture here of this area. Here's the city of Washington over here. New York City is up here, and her home state of Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, is up here. You can see that the move was indeed considerably far west to Cincinnati, which is situated on the Ohio River, which forms this southern border here of Ohio and Indiana, and continues then on down to the Mississippi. And of course, that was a thoroughfare through to the Caribbean. Now, this also is the line between the north and the south, running through here. So she was in a northern state, technically, but just on the border. And you can easily see that runaway slaves from these southern states, but especially from Tennessee and Kentucky, would be most likely to filter in through Cincinnati. And Cincinnati, of course, was a kind of hotbed of controversy over this whole business of slavery. University students always do tend towards the liberal end of the political spectrum. For that matter, so do university faculty members. That has been true in American history probably since Harvard was founded in 1636. They certainly have been towards the liberal end of the spectrum. Anyone familiar with the 60s and the involvement of faculty and students, for instance, in the Vietnam War protests, will recall that sort of political alignment of universities. They were certainly very liberal in Stowe's time. At Lane Theological Seminary, for instance, in Cincinnati, where her father was president and her husband was a faculty member, the students were working with African Americans, that is, escaped slaves, the indigenous escaped slave population of Cincinnati. In 1834, they had been there just 2 years, the trustees of Lane Theological Seminary passed a resolution which forbade the student body from being involved in social work, as we would call it today, with these students. And a substantial portion of the student body resigned. And the effect of this, as it touched the Stowes, was very personal. Lane Theological never really recovered, never really built its enrollment back, and of course salaries suffered. In 1836, riots broke out in Cincinnati, fueled by those who were pro-slavery, and anti-abolitionist. And this gives us a picture of how ambiguous the whole slavery issue was, even in a northern city. Not everyone was automatically an abolitionist. Again, you need to keep in mind the geography. Remind ourselves of that map and the location of Cincinnati, very close to all of these slave states down here, under constant influence from escaped slaves, and of course the employment was affected by a constant flow of fugitive slaves coming into the economy. So by 1838, however, Harriet had become thoroughly committed to the abolitionist position, and in 1845 she wrote an essay which called for immediate emancipation. In fact, that was the title, Immediate Emancipation. And in that, she was somewhat in opposition to her father, whose position was more of a gradualist position, that these things would work out over time. In 1850, after having lived for many years in Cincinnati, her husband, Calvin Stowe, received an offer to go to Bowdoin College in Maine to take up a chair, and this was the college that Nathaniel Hawthorne had attended earlier. And the family they were poor after years of decline in Cincinnati, and so they welcomed this move and moved off to Maine. In 1850, the compromise position politically came in as a kind of forerunner to the Fugitive Slave Law, and then in 1851 the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, and requiring that Northerners would support the Southern owners of slaves whose slaves had escaped, and would assist in returning those slaves to them. This, in effect, put the North in compliance with the South on the slavery issue. Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister-in-law, Mrs. Edward Beecher, wrote an interesting letter to Harriet containing these words: If I could use a pen as you can, I would write something that will make this whole nation feel what an accursed thing slavery is. And the story is that Harriet made a decision at that point when she read that. She stood up, crumpled the letter up, and said, I will write something, with an interesting tag to it, if I live, which suggests that she was well aware that the abolitionist position was not entirely a safe one to have, even in Maine. The galvanizing incident, however, for her was a kind of vision that she had in February of 1851. This was actually during communion at church. And in the midst of this religious ritual, Stowe had a kind of vision, an imaginative vision of a black man being beaten mercilessly to death, praying all the while for his torturers to be saved. And she broke down in the middle of communion, barely able to contain herself physically. She felt it was a kind of inspiration, and it was in fact, and she went home and made notes immediately, it was in fact the triumphant final scene of Uncle Tom's Cabin, chapter 40, The Martyr. Harriet Beecher Stowe then took up the challenge that had been issued by her sister-in-law and began to write. Here, for instance, is a little bit of the manuscript from that chapter called Uncle Tom. And about 5 months later, on June the 2nd, 1851, the first installment of her story appeared. There it is on June 2nd, 1851, in an abolitionist paper called the National Era. And here it is, Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, by Mrs. H.B. Stowe. And this is the first chapter in which the reader is introduced to a man of humanity, her first chapter. And thereafter, for the next, 40 some odd weeks, running from June all the way through to the next spring, weekly, without fail, her installments, chapter by chapter, for this work continued to appear. Now let's look at her writings. These, with the exception of the very first, the Mayflower, are all in one way or another connected to the issue of abolition. The Mayflower, written in 1843 when she was back in Cincinnati, is a collection of tales and sketches from New England. Nothing particularly exciting here. It's long out of print. Her essay, Immediate Emancipation, in 1845, marks the beginning of her abolitionist position. After the months of serialization of Uncle Tom's Cabin, beginning in June of 1851 and running through to the spring of 1852, the entire book was then gathered up and published in 1852. And since people wondered about the authenticity of the picture that she had presented, the year after, she published A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which consisted of evidence collected out of court records and other documents to support her view of slavery that she had presented in the book. And her second novel, published in 1856, Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp, is of course also out of print, but this is her other work that that deals with the anti-slavery movement. Now, these are her early writings. In a little while, we'll put up some of her later writings in a separate screen. But these ones, with the exception of the Mayflower, are all connected with the anti-slavery movement. And of course, they all take place, they are all published in that decade before the outbreak of the Civil War. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, Stowe suddenly became a woman of passion and eloquence. She took up the abolitionist cause with enormous fervor. She wrote with inspiration, with moral purpose. Her Calvinist and theological background, absorbed from the Beecher family and from her brothers, her father, her husband, gave her a sense that her writing was for a purpose. It was not mere escapism. She is, in fact, one of the very first writers in American literature who is part of the Realist movement. And even though her early reading as a girl did include a good bit of sentimental romance and women's fiction, and it certainly did have an influence on her writing. There is, for instance, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, a good bit of melodrama. Nevertheless, Uncle Tom's Cabin fell far more into a realist depiction of the situation in America at this time in the 1850s. And the the realist movement. This is perhaps the only work of realism that we look on in this course. Realism, of course, after the Civil War becomes the major dominant concern. In the follow-up course to this, English 3351, American literature since the Civil War, realism occupies our time a good bit of the time through the first half of that course, all the way up to the turn of the century. As a realist, thus, she saw her fiction not as providing an imaginative escape to a long ago and far away or an imaginative realm. It was not loaded with a lot of symbolism. Realism for Stowe was an opportunity to confront readers with the reality of the world, its problems, its injustices, and the immoral practices she saw all around her that were calling for immediate reform. Uncle Tom's Cabin is an interesting story. Uncle Tom and his wife, Aunt Schlo, live in a cabin, probably a log cabin or a small wooden cabin on the Shelby land. They're part of they're owned by the Shelby family. This is in Kentucky. Aunt Schlo functions as the head cook for the Shelby household. Uncle Tom is a kind of leader of the slaves. He is a Christian of immense faith and conviction, and throughout this novel, Christianity is portrayed as a source of enormous strength and vitality, moral strength and spiritual strength. And this allows Uncle Tom, as he's called, to withstand and endure the injustices of slavery that he has to go through in this story. The novel begins with the Shelby family, the owners, in great financial difficulty. And the opening scene, chapter 1, which is in the anthology, is called "In which the reader is introduced to a man of humanity." And this shows Mr. Shelby resisting the selling of slaves. But he is in financial difficulty and he has little choice. And they must sell some slaves. It should be noted that Shelby slaves are very well treated. They are not Southern plantation slaves. They are very highly regarded. Uncle Tom, in fact, is much trusted. He has actually traveled into Ohio and come back honorably, living up to the trust that his owner has put in him. And Mrs. Shelby has treated a young woman called Eliza very well too. Eliza is married to another slave who has another owner nearby, and he, in these early chapters, is forced to flee. But Eliza stays with the Shelbys, and she is well treated too, and it's clear that Mrs. Shelby regards her very well and has taught her and educated her. She is kind of high-class woman. Well, the sale goes forward, and the terms are that Uncle Tom will be sold, and also Eliza's young son, who's just a very tiny boy, a couple of years old, Harry. But early in the story, Eliza discovers this, and before the new owner, whose name is Haley, can take possession, she acts. She gathers up her son that night, goes to Uncle Tom and Aunt Schlo with the news, and Uncle Tom says, "No, I'm not going to leave, even though I've been sold. I'm not going to leave." But Eliza takes off with her young son Harry in the night, traveling north on the road. Now, at this point, the novel breaks into two stories, a main plot and a subplot. The main plot shows Uncle Tom being sold to Haley, and we follow him in that plot as he is taken south on the Ohio and the Mississippi, and that story ends up way down in Louisiana in the deepest part of the South. The subplot moves in the opposite direction. Eliza flees in the night and heads north to the Ohio River. The immediate concern, once this is discovered the next morning for Haley, who's just purchased these two slaves, is to capture Elijah, so the subplot unfolds first. The anthology selections include this wonderful chapter 7, which is called The Mother's Struggle. This is one of the most popular chapters in the book, one of the best known of all scenes in American literature. Eliza reaches the banks of the Ohio, but Haley is close on her tracks. And then we get this scene, and it all takes place in just 2 paragraphs, but 2 of the best-known paragraphs in American literature. Just in time, she makes a jump to an ice floe. This is February. The river is frozen, but ice is broken on the river. And we get this scene. Nerved with strength such as God gives only to the desperate, with one wild cry and flying leap, she vaulted sheer over the turbid current by the shore on the raft of ice beyond. It was a desperate leap, impossible to anything but madness and despair, and Haley, Sam, and Andy instinctively cried out and lifted up their hands as she did it. The huge green fragment of ice on which she alighted pitched and creaked as her weight came on it. But she stayed there not a moment. With wild cries and desperate energy, she leaped to another and still another cake, stumbling, leaping, slipping, springing upwards again. Her shoes are gone, her stockings cut from her feet, while blood marked every step. But she saw nothing, felt nothing, till dimly as in a dream she saw the Ohio side and a man helping her up the bank. "You're a brave gal now, whoever ye are," said the man with an oath. And that's it, in 2 paragraphs. That's the whole scene. Yet this is one of the most famous scenes ever written in American literature. Here, for instance, is a child's version of the story. It's called Pictures and Stories, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a much abridged version of the story, but you see the picture on the front. Here's the river and the ice floes, and Eliza leaping from one to the other in an old wood engraving. This is a 19th century woodcut. The nature of this book, in fact, is that it is very scenic. The novel, published serially, lent itself to a kind of scenic treatment. The nature of an installment is that it has to be a kind of rounded sketch, and 19th century novels that were first published this way do have a kind of scenic a beginning, ending, and sort of a wrap-up in each chapter. They tend to be very solid in terms of their chapter structure, a sense of completion in each episode. Well, even though, as we say, Eliza elects to stay, Uncle Tom does not, and he keeps his duty to his master. And he's taken in chains then to a new home downriver to Louisiana, separated from his wife and children. And on a boat, he experiences some really terrible abuses. He sees a son taken away from a mother, for instance, which has a nice echo, but opposite to what has happened with Eliza, where she has escaped to the north with her son. And the mother, in that case, on the boat on the Mississippi, throws herself overboard in her grief. The crucial development, however, in Uncle Tom's voyage down the river is a friendship that he strikes up with a young girl, this young girl called Eva St. Clair, short for Evangeline. And the chapter called Evangeline is in the anthology selections. And just after this friendship is struck up, he saves her from drowning, and her father then buys Tom, and he is taken to the St. Clair plantation. A friendship of great and deep, really deep religious feeling grows up. And St. Clair himself then comes, through the influence of Tom's Christianity, comes to see the evils of slavery and the value of Christianity. And Eva urges her father, to free Tom. But there's a kind of tragedy that occurs. She dies, Eva dies, and the father is accidentally stabbed. He dies, and so Tom is never released. And his wife then resells Tom down the river, and a new owner comes in by the name of Simon Legree. He is merciless and cruel. Uncle Tom is beaten. He does not resist, and of course his spiritual resistance is visible all the way, but he refuses to become a brute, and he provokes the wrath of Simon Legree. There's some interesting illustrations that have been done. Here's one version of the slave auction where St. Clair's wife sells Tom to Simon Legree. Here's another one. Well, following one vicious beating, Uncle Tom is helped by Cassie, a fellow slave. She has been a victim of sexual exploitation. Tom talks her out of murdering Legree, but Cassie and another slave called Emmeline escape, and Tom then refuses to join the search party, and indeed refuses to tell him any information, and this leads to that climactic chapter called The Martyr. Legree retaliates. He beats Tom mercilessly and savagely, and in fact beats him to death. Tom's victory, if we can call it that, is that Cassie and Emmeline do successfully escape. And in fact, there is some connection between them and Eliza, who is now safely in Canada, though we don't really have time to go into the intricacies of this plot. This is a novel that I would say every American ought to read. It's, as I say, the great bestseller of the 19th century. Tom's victory is a spiritual victory. Now, central to this novel is the theme of property, and here we can see Harriet Beecher Stowe working very hard on a theme that aggravated her enormously. The first chapter, which is in the anthology, of course, introduces the theme because we see the negotiations between Mr. Shelby and Haley, in which two slaves are simply treated as property that can be exchanged for money. In chapter 5, which is not in the anthology, we have a curious title. It's called Showing the Feelings of Living Property on Changing Others. And the others affected here are, of course, Shelby and Mrs. Shelby. And it's their great affection for Eliza and Tom that and the emotional impact of this impasse. They're broke and they need money, and so have to sell these slaves, but they are fiercely devoted to them. And of course, that from Stowe's point of view is undercutting the whole notion of people as property. If you can get emotionally involved with them to this extent, this suggests that perhaps they really aren't property after all. Chapter 10, when Tom is sold off, is called "The Property is Carried Off," reinforcing this people as property theme. And then in chapter 11, this is in our anthology, the property theme comes up again. The title of this chapter is called "In Which Property Gets into an Improper State of Mind." And this refers to Eliza's husband, who, now that he is free and disguised, has all the attitudes of a freed Anglo white person. He believes he has rights. He just doesn't act like a piece of property anymore. He acts like a normal human being. And here is Stowe, again, working her propaganda to say that really all human beings have rights, that the notion that human beings can be property under any circumstances is a fallacious one. And of course, the slave warehouse chapter, which is chapter 30, we come back to that last screen again, we can see again that slave warehouse, which is sort of the archetypal image of people being treated as property. And this property theme, as much as any in the novel, reveals Harriet Beecher Stowe's moral position on slavery. With her strong religious background, unshakable moral principles, her own personal shock at the treatment and mistreatment of African Americans, she set out in Uncle Tom's Cabin to lay bare the abhorrent attitudes that went along with slavery and which in fact made slavery possible. Now, there were sources for all of this in real life. One of these is Josiah Henson. Josiah Henson was a black preacher who lived in the town of Don in Ontario, Canada, which is now the town of Camden. Stowe got to meet him during a trip he had made to Boston, and she met him at her brother's house. Now, Josiah Henson had been a slave in Maryland, as Frederick Douglass had been. He had escaped after being very badly flogged as a youth, so badly that both of his shoulders were broken irreparably, and he was a permanent cripple. He had been converted, he had learned preaching, and he was a devoted Christian, and he regularly prayed for his master, forgiving him and praying for his salvation. And those who fault Uncle Tom as being an unrealistic kind of character in his total martyrdom need to recognize that Stowe did pull this example from real life. And Stowe heard the story, and she was particularly moved by his forgiving of his vicious master, even though he was left a cripple by the beatings. And the character of Uncle Tom is in large measure drawn from Josiah Henson. Incidentally, later when Henson wrote a biography, Harriet Beecher Stowe supplied an introduction for that book. But there were other sources, too, in her own life. And some of these are related in the preface to the first illustrated edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is in the anthology, though not assigned on the course. It begins on page 2399, and anybody who's particularly interested in Stowe, I'd urge that you read those few pages. When Stowe was living in Ohio on a steamboat, she witnessed the sale of a slave right before her eyes and the separation of a husband and wife. She witnessed that herself on the Ohio River. Stowe's own husband and brother on one occasion had traveled with a fugitive slave at night. In Ohio, Stowe had helped write letters for one of her own servant girls. to her husband, who was still a slave in Kentucky. And this slave, incidentally, was free to move back and forth between Kentucky and Ohio, but elected to honorably stay with his owner in Kentucky rather than escaping to Cincinnati, where his wife lived with the Stowe family. Earlier, in her sister's school, back in Connecticut, when Stowe was still in her adolescent years, one of the children in the school was seized because she was the daughter of a slave who had never been emancipated. And in settling an estate, she was going to be sold to raise money for the estate and get it settled. And members of the community around the school raised the money to purchase that girl's freedom. But such events had a profound effect on Harriet Beecher as a girl. And then, of course, there was the vote of the trustees at Lane Theological, where her father and husband taught, forbidding students to work with slaves. In Cincinnati, a man by the name of Dr. Bailey set up an anti-slavery newspaper. This would be like Frederick Douglass's The Liberator, I suppose. A mob of angry slave owners from Kentucky crossed the Ohio, vandalized and destroyed his offices, and he was driven out of Cincinnati. He had to go to Washington, D.C. to set up his newspaper there. And during such riot, even the freed Negroes, legally freed Negroes in Cincinnati, endured a great deal of harassment. They were threatened, pursued, sometimes beaten if caught. Of course, then there's one other incident in Alton, Illinois in 1837. A man by the name of Elijah Lovejoy, who had founded an anti-slavery paper. This was witnessed by Stowe's brother. His office was destroyed, his house was burned, and he was shot. And Edward Beecher, who witnessed this, called this a martyrdom. So what Stowe saw then with slavery was a terrible violation of human rights, and also that the abolitionists who opposed this were in great danger. And she realized that to take up the abolitionist cause was, in fact, to put oneself in great peril. The Fugitive Slave Law, of course, of 1850 became the event that galvanized her into action. And by this time, of course, she was back in New England, but the Fugitive Slave Law meant that it wasn't enough simply to escape to the northern states. One now had to go to Canada truly to be free. The North was now in complicity with this law as they attempted to send slaves back, and abolitionists were a group that was becoming despised and in danger and derided by the establishment even in the North. So this is where Harriet Beecher Stowe made her stand. Slavery was in her theological structure a sin, the most damaging and most far-reaching sin she believed in all of American history. And Uncle Tom's Cabin, from end to end, shows and illustrates that the North was as guilty as the South in the perpetuation of slavery. So she set about to write this book with a fervor and a passion unequaled, really, in other writers of the period. It's difficult to know her original conception for the book. She seems to have visualized it in compact scenes that could be issued weekly, and it's doubtful if she had the whole plan of the book in mind. She didn't really seem to know how many issues it was going to take. At first, she just suggested a half dozen installments, but the thing kept growing and growing, and even the publisher who was interested in publishing got a little nervous. He wondered if the public could actually stand a book on abolition that was that long. Of course, one can't ignore the individual scenes, and this book is one that is eminently illustrated by chapters. One can take chapters like this, and while you don't get the whole story, you do get incidents, scenes that are highly visual. The chapter 4, An Evening in Uncle Tom's Cabin, is certainly a foundation one for the book. It establishes the fundamental values of Uncle Tom as husband and family man, and of course, Christian. Everywhere in this book, from beginning to end, this book is overlaid with Christianity. Of course, this comes from the Beecher family, a highly religious and theological family. And if there's probably anything that some modern readers object to, it's perhaps the almost overbearing quality of the religion, where perhaps many modern readers just don't feel as fervent about Christianity as the characters in this book do. On the other hand, we need to keep in mind what Stowe is doing. It is clear that there is no context in the 1850s for dealing with slavery. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution have clearly broken down as defining documents which will, in fact, do away with slavery. The actual legal structure of the country is not only broken down, and the rights of all human beings and so on just haven't been extended to African Americans. And then you get new laws coming in which were actually reversing the situation, like the Fugitive Slave Law, we could see that there was really no moral, spiritual foundation for arguing about this issue. And perhaps it is Stowe's insight that by a kind of importation of the entire structure of New Testament Christianity, laying it over top of this abolitionist issue and putting the whole business of slavery into this New Testament Christian context, maybe there is a foundation for discussing it, for dealing with it. And indeed, this is her perspective, that once you define slavery as a sin in theological terms, then one can apply all of the biblical injunctions, the rules of humility and so on, the sacrifice that is attributed to Jesus on the cross, the martyrdom and so on. All of these categories can be attached to the whole situation of slavery and provide a moral foundation for judging it. And this, I think, is what the book accomplished. And as I say, while we may not particularly feel strongly about that particular structure, it served its purpose, and it clearly served its purpose for readers of this book in the 1850s. A chapter which matches rather well the Uncle Tom's Cabin chapter is, of course, chapter 14, called Evangeline. This is where he sets up the friendship with the little girl Eva, and befriending her. This is an expression of his basic humanity, but of course her response to him, too, a young white girl to a black man, is a kind of child's view of the African American. She has no preconceptions which would lead her to judge him because of his membership in a race, and of course she is a true innocent. She is a young girl who is enamored of him and of the stories and of his friendship before the devastating racism of adult America has intervened. And of course, when Uncle Tom saves her from drowning, he is cast into the role of hero. And this is terribly important because in American literature, there have not been any African-American heroes to this point. Heroes have, at best, almost always been white Anglo-Saxon males. We do have white women as heroines in Hester Prynne and so on, but we really don't have, and I suppose in Charlotte Temple too, and the Coquette, we have white women as heroes, but we really don't have a black man. And of course we have a double. We have a hero in Uncle Tom, and we have a heroine in Eliza. Of course, these scenes are melodramatic in the extreme. The purchase of Tom by Eva's father, the conversion of Eva and her father by the slave. This is melodramatic, pure and simple. But we do need to remind ourselves that melodrama is probably the winning formula in fiction, not only American but also European. The big social melodrama has been a kind of winning novel fictional plot all the way back to the 18th century. Whether or not it's great art is another question, but when we talk about books which have had an immense popularity, whether we want to go all the way back to Tom Jones in the 1840s or up to, let's say, Gone with the Wind in 1936, social melodrama is a winning plot formula that has served popular fiction very, very well, and it certainly does serve this book rather well. Women also, because this is written by a woman, women come out very powerful in this book. Aunt Schlo, for instance, is a domestic woman, a full equal to Uncle Tom, and in her bearing up with him separated and sold off, she reveals true feminine strength. She's devoted and honest, and she has a true sense of equality in the relationship. In Mr. and Mrs. Shelby, as portrayed in Chapter 5, are also people of humanitarian values, and it's clear Mrs. Shelby is strongly in support of keeping these slaves and very much against the sale of them, and she is stricken by the tragedy of Eliza perhaps being separated from her young son, and she voices very strong feelings for Uncle Tom, and she does everything she can to delay Haley in taking off after Eliza. In little subtle ways, she takes a long time to cook the meal and does everything to give Eliza a good head start. And that, it turns out, is effective, because Eliza had Haley been 15 minutes early, he would have caught her before she could make that dash across the ice floes on the Ohio River. Again, in Chapter 13, we have a Quaker family, and who shelter Eliza in Ohio for a time. And again, there's true feeling here. Eliza identifies the woman of this family as a kind of mother. And again, we see great domestic harmony all the way through. Of course, the scene that stands out is that escape scene across the Ohio where Eliza becomes a heroine, and this, incidentally, is one of the most often depicted scenes in art and in the theater. Here's one rendition of it. You'll notice that Eliza is virtually white. In fact, she is unmistakably white. She's a slave but she has white parentage, and so you can't really tell that she's not white. And that, of course, too, had made a mark on the American reader who couldn't even see in someone like Eliza someone who should even be identified with the African American. Many versions of this have been done artistically, and all of them enormously dramatic. And every time this thing has been staged, and it was staged as early as 1853. Here, for instance, is a notice for Uncle Tom's Cabin being done in 6 acts. One of the most often staged of novels through the 19th century. This scene always gets applause. It always renders audiences speechless and silent, and then brings them to great applause. An index of how this scene is almost archetypal in American literature is, if any of you care to have another look at that old film with Yul Brynner, The King and I, when the King of Siam, this is late 19th century, wants to impress the British by putting on some show, Anna suggests that they stage this scene from Uncle Tom's Cabin. And of course, if you know the original and you watch these Orientals doing this scene, you know, with their sashes and so on, representing the water on the river and so on, it is really very interestingly done. The flight itself across the river is almost mythic. It's a kind of crossing of the Jordan to Canaan, a movement from bondage to freedom. But then, of course, we come to that climactic scene where Uncle Tom's martyrdom, and it is clear from Stowe's use of biblical imagery that she is creating him in mythic terms. Tom is now in the position where he's going to be approached about where Cassie and Emmeline have disappeared, and he's resolved he's not going to tell. He felt strong in God to meet death rather than betray the helpless. So Tom is not going to betray these 2 women who've escaped. He sat his basket down by the row and looking up said, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit. Thou hast redeemed me, O Lord God of truth." And of course, words taken directly from the New Testament, Jesus' words here. And then quietly yielded himself to the rough, brutal grasp with which Quimbo seized him. And of course, he's then hauled before Legree. Legree said, "I'll count every drop of blood there is in you and take him one by one till ye give up." Tom looked up to his master and answered, "Master, if you was sick or in trouble or dying, and I could save ye, I'd give ye my heart's blood. And if taking every drop of blood in this poor old body would save your precious soul, I'd give him freely as the Lord gave his for me." Oh, Master, don't bring this great sin on your soul. It will hurt you more than it will hurt me. Do the worst you can. My troubles will be over soon. But if ye don't repent, yours won't never end. A kind of condemnation of his master to damnation. Like a strange snatch of heavenly music heard in the lull of a tempest, this burst of feeling made a moment's blank pause. Legree stood aghast, then, foaming with rage, smote his victim to the ground. Well, what Harriet Beecher Stowe did was she took a whole nation inside the consciousness of the slave. She restored the slave as having a personal, subjective reality, with rights, with feelings, with values, religion, morality, loyalty, and honor. And she gave the slave a voice, a dialect, conversation, words. Her people come on stage with words, and behind the words, thought and values. Uncle Tom, as I say, has been criticized as being too willing a victim. And the term Uncle Tom has been sometimes used as a kind of term of derision for a certain kind of compliant African American. To some extent, this is a time-bound interpretation. It grows out of a period in our time when of black power, when to act and to act forcibly and strongly is sometimes regarded as the only appropriate way to act. Uncle Tom's way of acting may very well have been the better way for many in the 19th century. That's of course a historical judgment that's very difficult to prove, and that's why I say it may have been. There's perhaps no final way to decide some of these things. What needs to be pointed out, though, is that he is based on real models that Stowe knew, that he is not the only slave in the story, that others do act very forcibly, both Eliza's husband and Eliza, and of course they are always the ones that are more likely to impress people. Stowe went on to write further works, but all of these have nothing to do with abolition. They're various novels. Most of them have been out of print. She did create quite a storm in 1870 with Lady Byron Vindicated. This was when Harriet Beecher Stowe exposed the fact that Byron, the poet, the British poet, had in fact had a long incestuous affair with his sister. And of course, Lady Byron is Byron's wife. And this did bring down a good bit of criticism on Stowe for getting involved. Why did she turn away from the anti-slavery issue? Well, once the Civil War came and the proclamation and the Emancipation Proclamation came, there was no more work for someone like Stowe to do. When, for instance, she met President Lincoln in 1863, he greeted her, and he was president. This was during his first presidential term. He was elected in 60, came to office in 61. So this is halfway through his first term. He greeted her as the little lady who made this big war. And of course, this was the year of the Emancipation Proclamation. And this suggests, I think, that in fact she stood in much the same position to the Civil War that Thomas Paine, with common sense, stood to the Revolutionary War. One other thing I wanted to notice, there's been a Stowe Society created, and this is April 1997. This is Volume 1, Issue 1, and what's interesting about this is that this newsletter comes right out of our own English department here on the University of Houston campus. The editor is right here on the campus. Of course, most major authors have societies and so on of people that do scholarship on authors, and this is a new one devoted to her. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe was truly a remarkable woman, writer of one of the great books of the 19th century. Perhaps it doesn't have the artistry of a Scarlet Letter or a Moby Dick or the Henry James novels, but one can forgive the lack of artistry in the sheer passion that this book produced. and selling 10,000 copies a week, 300,000 copies the first year. By the end of the first year, it was absolutely clear that this book would be the greatest bestseller of the last half of the 19th century. And of course, it's never been out of print since. Well, have a good day.